It's an honor for me to introduce Dr. John Hausdoerffer this evening, will come up in a minute. Over the past few years, I've gotten to know him as a colleague and a collaborator on a number of environmental education projects here in Western Colorado. He is the dean of the School for the Environment and Sustainability at Western Colorado University in Gunnison. And where there, he serves as the professor of environmental sustainability and philosophy. He's also a fellow with the Center for Humans and Nature, which is based in Chicago. And in addition to Wildness, his book, Hausdoerffer is also the author of Caitlin's Lament, Indians' Manifest Destiny, and The Ethics of Nature. He's also the editor of this great book called Letters from the Headwaters, which you can find other places. We don't have it tonight, but tonight he's going to be sharing from his book called Wildness here in my hands, and he has copies for purchase at the end of the evening. So tonight he will present from his book, and it's just a really special opportunity for him to be here. He's going to bring some stories from his recent trip to Rome, and with that, I'll let him have the stage. And he's not going to use slides.
Thank you so much to Sarah and to ACES and to Wilderness Workshop and to the Roaring Fork Audubon and to all of you for coming out on a beautiful winter night. Let's hope there's some snow soon, maybe this weekend, right? We will talk about snow tonight. I want to open with just a gesture of friendship from the Gunnison Valley to your valley here, from our side of the Elk Mountains to your side of the Elk Mountains. In my role as dean, I direct the Master in Environmental Management program, and that program is designed to assist communities with getting environmental projects done. Price, where are you? Price Hadley is here. He's one of our graduate students, works for Pitkin County Open Space. One can earn their master's from their internship or their job in their home community and use that work as their master's project for us. And so that allows for us to help organizations get projects off the back burner around the world. We've had projects completed as far as Kenya, Colombia, Paraguay, Costa Rica, the tar sands of Alberta, Yosemite, Yellowstone, but we really want to serve the elks well. So if that speaks to you in any way as a future grad student, as an organization, please let us know how we can partner with you, how we can assist you in reaching your goals. When I'm done speaking tonight, the back table here, in addition to some cool stuff from ACES and Wilderness Workshop, I just shared some of our visionary material. One of the things that's happened in the 5 years of our master's program is we're starting to see patterns across these master's projects. And we're bundling around those patterns and creating collectives. And so we have the Wildness and Diversity Collective, groups of students serving wilderness needs in diverse communities, culturally diverse communities. We have the Mountain Resilience Collective, and now in partnership. We have Eric Smith and Carino DeVore here from Aspen International Mountain Foundation. We just came back from the UN in Rome together, thinking with other mountain nations around how can we address mountain resilience, right? And so how many countries were there, Carino? 75 countries. Yeah, it was incredible, and incredibly humbling. Because when we think about mountain communities, we're talking about affluent communities in the West. But globally, mountain communities, 1 in 3 people have food insecurity. Globally, mountain communities have higher poverty rate than other developing communities in developing nations. And so mountain communities, in addition to being the world's water towers, where billions of people get their water and their food, right? Mountain communities are also very impoverished. And so as mountain people, right, how can we build solidarity, not just across the Elk Mountains, but with mountain communities around the world that don't have our affluence? So we're starting to work together on that. That collective is starting to form. Looking at how to transition in the West, right, toward more sustainable communities and economies. Dave Ellerbrook is here, a colleague of mine from Denver. Hey, Dave. And he and I are trying to start a sort of sustainability transitions collective. And so we have information about all of that, as well as the grad program in the back corner. It's all gestures of friendship. If these efforts serve you and your passion for the Mountain West or the world, just reach out to me. My card's back there as well. So tonight I want to talk about renewal. All right, there's sort of the dark cloud of sort of 2 mad clowns in the news talking about who has a bigger nuclear button. All right, there's that. All right, there's something that happened on like the 25th floor of the Trump Tower that might have been treason, right? California was on fire, Houston was underwater, and 70,000 Puerto Ricans found their homes uninhabitable this year, right? There's a lot happening right now it's making our places less and less resilient, right? Less and less livable, less and less inhabitable. And I don't want to talk about the doom and gloom of that moment. As a couple days after New Year's Eve here, I want to talk about renewal tonight. And I want to talk about wildness as renewal. All right? So keep that in mind. Renewal, renewal, renewal. I think it's important to first make a distinction between wilderness and wildness. Amy and I were talking on the radio this morning about that. Both are vital. Okay, both are vital. Wilderness, I'll define as zoned acreage on public lands, zoned to keep industrial activity out and to keep mechanized vehicles out so that we can have enhanced biodiversity, so that keystone predators can have migratory areas, so that we can address things like species extinction, so that we can have a baseline for studying climate change, and so we can have spaces for solitude and human spiritual fulfillment. Wilderness acreage, all 110 million acres that we have of wilderness-zoned land within our public lands areas is completely vital to this world's survival and to humans thriving. Okay, that's wilderness, right? In addition to those 110 million acres, we also happen to have roadless areas, right? We also happen to have acreage outside of wilderness areas in national parks, national monuments that sort of encroach upon being considered wilderness land, right? And so it's pretty incredible when you think about it, that 110 million acres plus of wilderness. 100 years ago, 105 years ago now, John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, one of the great wilderness visionaries, faced a heartbreaking moment in Yosemite where he was up against Gifford Pinchot, Teddy Roosevelt's first U.S. forest chief, and Gifford Pinchot was trying to figure out how to get water and power to the city of San Francisco, and saw the Hetch Hetchy Valley as a way to do that without mega corporations owning the West's water, a way to provide affordable water and power to people. He was a populist, and he thought if you dammed Hetch Hetchy, you would still have Yosemite Valley, and you would also be able to provide for the people in an affordable way. And John Muir was like, damn Hetch Hetchy, right? That's like damming cathedrals, right? And for him, it was like this sacrilege to dam something. And for him, the vital meaning of wilderness, right? The sacred value of wilderness was when you disturbed something that wasn't made by humanity, that could not be replaced by humanity. It's this idea of like flooding a cathedral, as David Brower later said. And Muir lost. Hetch Hetchy was dammed. And a year later, Muir died. And historians sometimes muse he died of a broken heart for the wilderness. And in that moment of loss, if someone could have told him that 105 years later, there would be 110 million acres of wilderness, there would be a Wilderness Act about 50 years later that defined that acreage as lands in which, quote, man is a visitor who does not remain, right? An act of Congress signed by a president that declared spaces in which we must be humble in the face of forces that are larger than us. He would have called you crazy in that moment of heartbreak if you told him a century later that would happen. And so what I want us to think about tonight is in this moment of heartbreak, whether your heart is breaking for Bears Ears, your heart is breaking for how climate change is disrupting the integrity of wilderness, in this moment of heartbreak, what's possible 100 years from now? And my suggestion tonight is going to be wildness as renewal. And so wilderness is that zoned land, okay? Wildness, though, I think you can find it anywhere, right? Wildness, as Gary Snyder says, is a process, not a kind of landscape, not a type of geography, but a process. The great wilderness historian Roderick Frazier Nash defines it as self-will. Any being with its own will is wild. Any landscape that doesn't require us to tame it, for it to be healthy, it has its own will. It's wild. That word wild is rooted in the word will. And you can find that wildness anywhere. Aldo Leopold, I think, made it even clearer. He said, wildness is the capacity for self-renewal. the capacity for a being, a species, a landscape, an ecosystem, a community, the capacity to renew itself. That's its wildness. And we don't just find capacity for self-renewal on wilderness landscapes. I'm going to argue tonight we can even find it on the south side of Chicago. Okay? And we can find the kind of renewal for ourselves that comes from connecting with the renewal of land anywhere. And we have to figure out how to find it anywhere and fight for it anywhere if there's going to be hope. Okay? So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. The book Wildness goes on kind of a journey. There's 20 different authors, and they follow kind of a continuum of wildness. And that continuum starts with wilderness land, and we have authors in there like Gary Snyder, like Roderick Frazier Nash, like Robert Michael Pyle, or some of the great thinkers of wilderness alive today. Moving down that continuum, you have working landscapes like ranches, and we have Joel Salatin, Courtney White, to think about that kind of landscape and how people on those landscapes can co-create wildness. And then moving down the continuum of sort of farming landscapes. Devon Pena, Wes Jackson, thinking about how the production of food also produces wildness. Moving all the way into urban areas where we have people like Michael Howard, Mistinguette Smith, Vandana Shiva, all talking about wildness in more urban spaces. So what I want to do tonight is kind of walk you down that continuum a little bit and share snippets from each essay that give you a sense of where is wildness in that spot in the continuum, and then we'll pause and think, what kind of renewal is happening there? What kind of renewal is happening there? And at the end, we'll think about how to connect them all. So I want to start with my own words, and since we're all hoping for a thriving ski season, the renewal of our snowpack, which is the basis of the renewal of everything, I'll open with a little bit of a ski story. Okay? February in Colorado's Elk Mountains can bring the sunshine that inspired Crested Butte's infamous naked skiers, or it can drop 10 feet of snow in a week. My 7-year-old daughter Adelia and I ride Crested Butte's high lift to the head wall at 12,000 feet. We look toward the Maroon Bells Wilderness area that divides our quiet valley from the buzz of Aspen. 16 miles, yet a 4-hour mountain drive to the north. Shafts of sunlight sneak through the beginning flurries of a predicted blizzard. The sky is wild, with a will of its own, indifferent to mine. I feel compelled to take in the 360-degree view from Headwall, scanning the Fossil Ridge, Ragas, West Elk, Maroon Bells, Powderhorn, and Uncompahgre wilderness areas, all visible from our 2-mile-high perch. Adelia, looking down upon these wilderness areas that she hikes with me every summer, asks me what wilderness is. Having spent much of my career studying the wilderness idea and having spent the previous week reviewing essays for this collection, I still do not have a good answer. So I have to warn you, you're about to hear a barrage of questions going on in my head before I answer a 7-year-old. If you've read the book, the questions will make more sense because I reference every author in these questions. So bear with me. Knowing that kids understand more than we realize, I wonder where to begin. Do I detail Robert Michael Pyle's entire continuum from his Denver ditch to the far reaches of the unknown? Do I explain the differences between wilderness, land zoned to protect habitat, to reduce human industrialized and mechanized presence, and to offer inspiration for those humans who can and want to seek it, versus wildness, any self-organizing, self-renewing being, community, or system? Or do I tell her what Enrique Salmon, these are all authors, right? Or do I tell her what Enrique Salmon might say, that there are cultures without a word for wild, because they do not differentiate, quote, beyond and between the human and non-human worlds? Or Gimiwan, a native Anishinaabe from this book, or Gimiwan's view that wilderness is simply home. Or Robin Kimmerer's reminder that what we call wilderness is often the human-shaped basis of livelihood within a people's homeland. She's Potawatomi. And she calls that homeland, quote, a carefully nurtured web of reciprocity between people and land. Do I go further to tell Adelia of concerns that wilderness can erase from memory those indigenous homelands by just calling them wilderness? Do I tell her that some critics have said that the wilderness idea itself has been a tool of colonialism, or that thinkers like Laura Watt worry that our pristine wilderness ideologies still justify, quote, aggressively pushing out long-established local uses? This debate's been going on for decades, right? It's divided the environmental community. Do I tell her what John Talmadge might say, that the Maroon Bells wilderness we gaze upon is not the only complex adaptive system to love, and that places like Cincinnati are equally places where we can encounter nature in its, quote, vivid, wild personhood? Do I tell her about Gavin Van Horn's Green Corps Chicago friends' hope for the urban wild as a place of, quote, peace, serenity, relief, fascination, and clarity of mind in the midst of urban poverty and violence? Or do I tell her about Michael Howard's view of Chicago's South Side and of Minnesota's boundary waters as reciprocally necessary to healthy communities everywhere? Or, still thinking of that same counterintuitive yet intricate Chicago wildness, 3,000 coyotes in the city limits of Chicago. There are camera traps, Price, capturing them, stopping at stoplights. It's like humans, crows, coyotes, cockroaches. We're going to somehow figure it out. It's not a very biodiverse world, 4 species, but they'll all be around somehow. Probably not humans. I hope so. Do I tell my daughter what Brooke Hecht might say, that I love all places in which, quote, the landscape itself is a story of life taking a chance on the edge? Do I tell her that the most sacred family stories, like those of Aaron Abeyta's grandfather, emerged from working within and carving a life out of wild land? Do I tell her what Rob Dunn might say, that the wild and, quote, belligerent gods of rebirth come to life as much in Adelia's backyard compost pile as in the subalpine forest sweeping below us? And that, as Margot Farnsworth reminds us, waste equals food. Waste should equal food for everything from decomposers to urban industrial visionaries. Do I explain to her the concept of the Anthropocene? She's 7, right? She's going to be pretty messed up. Do I explain to her the concept of the Anthropocene, the notion that humans now drive and are entangled in all environmental change, and thus pose to her Julianne Warren's question, quote, what is this making of wilderness, of earth integrated and whole? Or do I tell her what Roderick Frazier Nash, awaiting my arrival at the base of the mountain, might say, that our species threatens to, quote, take down more than half the planet's wild species in a century, and that with the wild goes both the habitat for and the existence rights of most non-human life on Earth? All of these are true views of the wild. And I've yet to process what wildness means when one combines all of these perspectives, let alone when one tries to translate such a collective view for a 7-year-old. Respecting Adelia's emerging understanding of a complex world, I almost tell her that wilderness is more about human potential than about pristine land. Smelling the dampening air until the cold freezes my nostrils, I almost explain that these wilderness areas depict the story of people deciding to slow themselves down before taking everything, deciding to engage the world with humility rather than just desire. Instead, I simply tell her that these areas that surround her home come from our hope to share the land with all of the other species with which we evolved. Adelia blinks at me through her goggles and simply says, I'm glad animals have places like that to live. Why didn't I just say that, right? I could have saved you like half hour there, right? Before I can add another layer to Adelia's comments, she asks if we can ski down to her 4-year-old sister's soul, waiting to share stories of a morning looking for snow fairies while gliding through the white world of Bambino, her favorite forested trail. Adelia and I tip our skis down the steeps of Headwall. So, that gives you a sense of the continuum in this book, right? Wilderness, working landscapes, etc. And I want to start by just sharing, just a couple quick snippets from the wilderness side of the continuum. And I think the wilderness side of the continuum, those authors, I think, focused on humility. This sense of a world that's larger than us. As Emerson said, right, when you're in the woods, I think he said something like, I am nothing, I see all. Right, that moment of recognizing how much bigger than you the product and processes of the universe are humbles the ego. And once you stop asking, what does the world do for me, and just ask, what is the world, you are nothing, you see all. And that's an incredible process, it's a process of enlightenment that I think wilderness can provide for people. And Gary Snyder, the great beat poet, right? For those of you who have read Dharma Bums, he's Jaffe Ryder, right? He's 86 now, and he was kind enough to offer a poem in which I think he captures that sense of a world larger than us, and that as wilderness. When he spoke at my university a couple of years ago, he said, wildness starts with your breathing and goes to the stretches of the universe. I just did it consciously, but you all have been breathing without thinking through each breath, right? You're not taming yourself. It's self-will in your body. That's your wildness in you. He says, go all the way out to the universe. And here's what he has to say in a poem he was kind enough to offer this book. For millions, for hundreds of millions of years, there were fires. Fire after fire. Fire raging forest or jungle, giant lizards dashing away, big necks from the sea looking out at the land in surprise. Fire after fire. Lightning strikes by the thousands, just like today, volcanoes erupting, fire flowing over the land, huge sequoia, 2-foot thick fireproof bark, fire pines, their cones love the heat. How long to say, that's how they covered the continents, 10 lakhs of millennia or more. I have to slow down my mind. Slow down my mind. Rome was built in a day. Right? Just that humility. You think of Rome as this giant endeavor, right? But it's nothing. Maybe our greatest achievement, nothing in the face of fire after fire for millennia, 10 lakhs of millennia or more. And I think that that's what people like Snyder feel is endangered, as Trump reviews 27, national monuments and starts to take acreage away. As climate change melts the ice in Isle Royale National Park that wolves use to migrate onto the island and control the moose population. Now the question is, with the ice melted and the wolves unable to migrate and there's only 2 wolves left, a father and a daughter, is it still wilderness if we're shipping the wolves there, right? Like, so many of these questions, confusing and threatening the idea of wilderness, but I think what he finds threatened is the possibility of that experience of humility. And in an age of every child having a screen in front of them, if we lose the landscapes of humility available to us, we're in some trouble culturally. So I think that's the real strength of some of the arguments around the wilderness end of the continuum. Shifting our tour down the continuum a bit and thinking about working landscapes, and there's a lot of ranching in this valley as well as my valley in Gunnison. There are some really exciting experiments happening around ranching. If you're ever in Gunnison, track me down. I can take you to Parker Pastures, where they're bunching cattle like wildlife and moving them around with similar migratory patterns, and instead of overgrazing, through that wildlife-inspired migratory patterning, they are actually restoring grasslands and calculating the carbon sequestration of those enhanced grasslands. The Allen Ranch, selling sustainable beef to the sort of Whole Foods network. They see themselves as grass farmers, right? Not as ranchers. That's wildness. That's the co-production of wildness. That's humans producing their livelihood, beef, in a way that not only reduces our carbon footprint. I haven't calculated the methane in that mixture. Maybe Dave can do that for me. Or Price, you already have a master's project, right? Yeah, okay. It's not only like, sequestering carbon, it's also producing habitat, right? And so what does it mean when the production of our livelihood also results in more biodiversity. Right? That's an exciting future for us. That's a renewal of the human purpose. Right? Our purpose is not just the 10,000-year-old story of God made the world for man and man was made to rule it. That story led us to the Dust Bowl. That story led us to Puerto Rico this fall. It's the renewal of another story in which, as Enrique Salmon says in here, perhaps humans could be a keystone species. A species that, through the production of its livelihood, allows for biodiversity and other species to exist elsewhere. You know, what would it mean for us to have a vision of wildness everywhere in which we tell a story of ourselves where we're co-creators in partnership with the more than human world, co-creators of wildness? How's that a new story for us? You think of the rhetoric of the last 40 years in the environmental movement, it's not very inspiring in a lot of ways. You know, they're important tactics, but not great strategies. Leave no trace. Reduce, reuse, recycle. Shrink your carbon footprint. We are certainly not a country, maybe not a species, that likes to think of itself as small. We want to be great. And isn't it a great story to think of ourselves as co-creators of wildness? So in the book here, we have Joel Salatin and Courtney White, people who work with ranchers, and themselves, and at least in Joel's case, themselves ranch in this style, in hopes of enhancing biodiversity through providing for livelihood through this form of grazing. Let's also think about renewal. When we were talking about the wilderness side of the continuum, I mentioned on the radio with Amy that, you know, you think of the reintroduction of wolves. You know, they allow for a large landscape to renew itself, as you all know, right? Because they help control the population of elk and deer, which reduces the overgrazing of grasslands, which reduces soil erosion, which allows, because of the richness of the soil, for that place to renew itself. Well, when it comes to renewal and wildness on the ranching landscapes that I'm talking about, it's not just the grasslands that are renewed. It's not just the habitat that's renewed. The possibility for a rancher to continue a way of life in a place is renewed. The possibility for a ranching community to build solidarity with the climate community, maybe find some extra funding to get their work done, right, is renewed. Moving down the continuum to farming, right? I'm lucky enough every summer to fly out and work with Wes Jackson from the Land Institute in Kansas. If you're not familiar with Wes's work, I think he's a visionary. He's a MacArthur genius, and he earned it. He's developed a perennial polycultural system on the former prairie of Kansas. And what Wes says is, we'll never restore the prairie as the prairie. You will not lift up the fences of the West and replace them with the diverse Native American cultures that were necessary for there to be a stable population of 30 million buffalo, which allowed for 250 plant species per acre, which allowed for deep roots and the sequestration of carbon and the filtering of water and the stabilization of soil and the providing of biodiversity and human livelihood. He says that's not going to come back. But can we restore the function of the prairie? That's the question he explores. The function, right? Its ability to stabilize soil, its ability to filter water, its ability to provide habitat and biodiversity, its ability to feed a culture. And so he's developed what's called perennial polyculture. It's a plant that's perennial, right? Food that grows back every year without tilling the soil and planting seeds. And so you think about not having to till, soil stability, reduction in fossil fuel usage, reduction in use of water. The algal aquifer does not have a lot of time left, right? He's figured out perennial plants pretty well. He has three major plants. One's a wheat-like plant called kernza. You can actually buy it. And then one's like sorghum-ish and one's sunflower-ish. And they're also biofuels. He's trying to now figure out polyculture. How could these perennial plants work off each other to control pests so you don't need pesticides, right? To fertilize, you don't need fertilizer, right? So that they are self-renewing. Self-renewing. And they're working on that. And so if you think about Wes Jackson and his work, there's, again, this co-creation of wildness that's possible if we rethink our story, right? And it's not just the renewal of the function of the prairie, right? It's also the renewal of the capacity of a people to continue a way of life in a place. They're giving up on certain aspects of a way of life. The story of rain follows the plow, extinct, has to be extinct, right? The story of the frontier, where there's always another place to exploit, so you don't have to take care of this one, extinct, has to be extinct, right? But what can be renewed there is a capacity for people who've been on that land for generations to stay there in a way that produces food and fuel for a society and restores the function of the prairie. Renewal, renewal, renewal. Right? Happy New Year. Right? These things are possible. Let me share with you a bit from the book again, and then we'll move down the continuum, and then we'll finish up and maybe talk a little. So, skiing with my daughter, right, in Crested Butte, I already read you a piece of that. In my conversation with Roderick Frazier Nash at the bottom of the mountain, he's a visionary wilderness thinker, wrote a beautiful book, Wilderness in the American Mind. How many of you read it or had it in your backpack at some point, right? Really an inspiration to me. He and I do have a disagreement, though. The way I just got us all, at least me, excited there, when he came to my class, he said, John thinks we're 1 inch below angels. Rod, think we're 1 inch above devils. And Rod says, he quotes E.O. Wilson, a Harvard biologist, and says, Darwin's dice rolled badly for the earth, right? Meaning we were created, right? And I'm like, no, look at these stories. Like, they're not just stories of indigenous people creating biodiversity. There's some modern stories. And we have this fun debate in here. And he ends up saying, how does he put it? Yeah, he calls it cohabitation. We can have cohabitation with the earth if we create what he calls an island civilization. He says, let's talk 1,000 years from now, John. He's like, my dad grew up in horse and buggy America. I fly around the world on a jet. So 1,000 years from now, food, water, energy, no problem. We can have these island civilizations where we live well together, and every other inch can be wilderness. He's like, wouldn't that be great, John? And I say, yes and no. I think we're capable of better than just making ourselves smaller, doing less bad. And so he calls it cohabitation, right? Us and our islands, wilderness and its wilderness. I talk about co-inhabitation, right? We can be co-creators of wildness. I still will fight for the 110 million acres of wilderness we have. I still would push for more acreage. But in terms of our best idea 1,000 years from now, it's not just more acreage. It's a new story for us. It's co-creators of wildness. So I want to share a bit of that debate with you, and I'll mention Wes Jackson in here, and then we'll move to the next part, stop in the continuum. I finished the bus ride to Crested Butte and ski one of my favorite stashes of fresh powder on a trail called Morning Glory. The snow is deep yet light, and the steep trees behind the spot where Adelia and I stood yesterday. Knowing this is one of Rod's favorite trails, I look for ski tracks to see if he's been here today. He's 78, still skiing, right? He's run the Grand 72 times on like a wooden dory. Yeah. All signs of skiers from weeks past are erased by blankets of fresh snow. Powder days tap into a deep cultural mythology, not unlike the unreal lore of pristine land. Skiing the first turns after a storm summons primordial feelings of being the first human on earth. And I experience this anew, dropping into snow up to my waist with each turn feeling as if I'm walking down clouds. That only happens tellying, by the way. I ski to the lodge. My thawing fingers tap my thoughts into the phone, replying to Rod's email. I like your term cohabitation a lot, Rod, as a tactic for protecting current wilderness areas. But what does that look like as a global strategy for the future wildness of the planet? One post-industrial example that fits my terms of co-inhabitation and co-creation through shared self-will is Wes Jackson's work at the Land Institute in Kansas. As you likely know, he's developing a perennial polyculture that restores the prairie's self-organizing ecological function while providing food and fuel on a major scale. He believes this new food system by end of century will require and cause a revolution of ecological consciousness, because in order to operate that system, you better know your ecology, right? So Jackson's vision is it's not just a new kind of food or a new kind of fuel or a restored function of the prairie, it's a new mindset for humans, right? He believes this new food system by end of century will acquire and cause a revolution of ecological consciousness beyond its accomplishments of reducing soil erosion, pesticides, carbon emissions, etc. The potential is there for a co-creative partnership that could result in more self-will for the land, rather than a new version of control. And Rod responds by saying, how's that any better than saying some slave owners were nice? You're still taming the land, right? And I like to be challenged. I learned a lot from Rod Nash. He's one of my heroes. And so that's our disagreement. But there's our stop in terms of what's possible. And that's not even mentioning the surge in local food systems, the surge in urban agriculture, which we'll get to in a second. Again, renewal, renewal, renewal. Renewal of ecosystems function, renewal of people in that place, right? Urban landscapes, our final stop on the tour. I know there's suburbia, and there's a beautiful essay in here written by a woman named Margot Farnsworth about the carpet company Interface Carpet that's like carbon neutral and has done incredible things with water efficiency and water quality, and have become real environmental advocates in the Atlanta area, and how through the suburban landscape around Atlanta, they got this vision of from the woods in around those suburbs for a new kind of carpet. But I'll just let you read about suburbia. We'll stop now on urban America. And I think that the essays in here about the south side of Chicago are really compelling. And the one that moves me the most is by a man named Michael Howard. And I'm going to show you a video from him in a second here, Sarah. And while you're setting that up, I'll set Michael up. Michael Howard's African-American baby boomer. And he's a descendant of people who came to Chicago from the Great Migration, pushed out of the South by the violence of slavery, the violence of Jim Crow. And his community in the Fuller Park neighborhood of Chicago is the most violent neighborhood. This is the neighborhood that Spike Lee calls Chirac, right? Yes. And he was sitting at home one night as a financial advisor, but still in his home community, refusing to leave. And was watching TV with his wife and saw a report about a nightline. Remember Nightline? About his dirt under his feet, his community having the third most lead-contaminated soil in the country. And it had a toxic waste dump. It was also a site of drug deals and violence for gangs. Bodies were dumped there, things like that. And, no, not that one, sorry. Go back. Scroll. Go to View More. Down in the middle, yep. Michael Howard. Yep, so I've made about 9 videos to go with the book. They're all people from these chapters. It's on humansandnature.org/wildness. Yep, and so all the videos are on here for free. They're about 10 minutes each. We're not going to watch all 10 minutes. Oh, Michael Howard, and then go to 424 once you get into Michael Howard. And so he pushes the city of Chicago to clean up this soil. And imagine the fight that took, coming from a black body in a neighborhood that had been historically easy to ignore, right? And he successfully did that. Then he cleaned up the toxic waste dump. While doing that, gangs from both sides that needed that dump for their economy were shooting at his house. So imagine that. After cleaning that up, he gets an NSF grant to restore a prairie flowing into a forest, mimicking the original Midwestern pre-settlement environment in that land, and off of that is a working urban farm to provide food to a food desert in that community. This guy's incredible, okay? Now, he also takes urban youth to the boundary waters to experience what he calls wilderness, what we've been talking about, wilderness-zoned land, right? That space where it's just the world's bigger than you, the humility we were talking about, right? But when he goes to take kids there, parents and grandparents push back. And he'll talk about that here, because when they think of the woods, they think of family stories of people being hanged from trees in the South. They think of family stories being people being chased by dogs while trying to escape from slavery. And as I said to Amy today on the radio, the woods for me is a space of liberation and transformation. What does it mean when that same kind of space is a trigger of deep cultural trauma for fellow humans and Americans, right? And so we have to think about that when it comes to renewal. We've got renewal going on here, right? And wildness. He's restoring the prairie. He's restoring a forest there. He says red-tailed hawks now circle his neighborhood. Coyotes are hanging out there, right? So renewal, absolutely. But how do you get renewal to happen when that's the story of his neighbors when it comes to the woods? So I asked him about that fear, and it starts on 424, Sarah.
I'll do my best to get that to happen. But we're
Yeah.
gonna push play to get started.
I can do it, and you can hit the lights. Oh, you can do it. I'll hit the lights. Yep.
We have to deal with here in those, specifically with the African American residents in Fuller Park and Brownsville. A lot of the fear goes back historically in regards to why a lot of people don't want to go to the woods. They don't want to go camping. They don't want to go out to the forest, all the forest preserves, because it goes back to our history with those areas. African Americans for many years, were lynched in America. And so African Americans, especially prior to the baby boomers, and even the baby boomers had experience with lynching, when they see a tree, it's not a positive reinforcement for them. The fear goes deep because even before the lynching was popular in America, there was atrocities that took place in woods. If you wanted to get rid of the body, you just take them out in the swamp, and you kill them. And then if you were trying to escape, you had to go through the swamp, which was a horrific journey for a lot of people trying to escape slavery. And so if you had to go through these swamps and these bayous of the South and these bug-infested forests trying to make it north, the last thing you want to see was another swamp, another forest, and you ingrain that fear in your children. It's like kids when they see a spider and they jump. That's a learned fear. And so the fear of the woods and the trees is a learned fear from the grandparents and the great-grandparents that transferred that fear onto their children. It's like, baby, we don't go to the woods. Baby, we don't hang out in no trees. We're going to go somewhere, we want some open grass where we can see. And so learned fear, ingrained generational, is a hard thing that we have to battle here. But I'm going to tell you, that's why we use fun so much here. That's why we try to engage them in activities in the outdoors that they will say, oh, okay, I'll try it, and then we will act like we're not paying any attention, but we're very carefully trying to make sure that experience for that family or for that child or for that adult is a positive one. Eden Place Farm Project, it has had some challenges. Getting people to work land, again, has been an uphill battle. The first thing out of their mouth, oh, no. We don't do that slave labor no more. Because learned connotation and historical, we worked 300 years for free on the land. Who wants to do that again? But there are benefits that we can take advantage of today by returning to the land. You stay pretty healthy working on the land, okay? Health-wise, you eat healthy if you're growing your own food.
That was May.
Are you going to purposely poison yourself? No, you're going to grow the best food you can for your family, okay? Spiritually, basically, you get an appreciation for the soil. It's like, man, you pick up your soil and, oh man, my soil is suffering. I got to do something to heal my soil. That's a real farmer, okay? When he can pick up his soil, look at the turf, look at the density, look at the organic matter, and be able to be a doctor. It sort of takes away a lot of the calluses that urban dwellers have when it comes to the great outdoors, the fear, the misinformation about the great outdoors. As we experience more and more here and give them a sampling of the great outdoors, they become better acclimated, and so it softens those calluses and that hardness that they have because they have no appreciation for it.
Thank you, Sarah. Right, and so, he's doing renewal work there, isn't he? He's helping those families become more comfortable with then going to boundary waters, right? He gives them a launch pad, a micro wildness to then experience wilderness, but he also gives them a landing pad. I used to run programs 25 years ago where we'd take, back then it was called at-risk youth, now it would be underserved youth, right? And out to Rocky Mountain National Park and do work and go on hikes and climb peaks and bring them back to the community, and it was like sending them back out into difficult, abusive family lives and, socially disruptive lives, and you need a landing pad. Right, and he has that as well, and it's a landing pad of wildness. And so through the renewal of just that little bit of acreage, he's renewing families that are still hurt from these stories of violence that started in the South. Right, and I think that to me is the most inspiring story of wildness as renewal offered in the project, as much as I am personally moved by wilderness. And it's incredible, the cultural diversity of different views of the uses and abuses, the dangers and benefits of wildness. There, a couple of Native American authors in here say, look, there's not a word for wild in our language. Y'all imposed that word on us when you told us our land wasn't ours, right? Andres Esparza, who runs Latino Outdoors in Wyoming, is one of our MEM graduates. He worked very closely in his master's projects with the Latino community of Montrose, right, and found very different. And for them, what they want from those spaces are places to gather large families, right? A student of mine years ago, her grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. And when she was 8, the grandmother, and at the end of the war, as many of you know, the Germans were acting desperately with the Russians coming in from one side, the Allies coming in from the other side. They were moving people from camp to camp, and her grandmother as a child was with her parents still, and was being moved across a steep slope. And this must have been planned out. But when the guards looked away, her mother pushed her down the slope into the woods, and there were people, an underground group of people living in the woods that took that child in. And her parents did not make it, and she made it, moved to the U.S., and then every Sunday took my student hiking in the woods. Sacred for a very different reason than why it is for me, right? Healing in a way that it's traumatic. Healing for them in a way that's traumatic for the people Michael's working with. And so when we talk about wildness, it comes down to figuring out how to engage diverse cultural communities with how to find it and fight for it everywhere, right? And if we're in this room tonight because we care deeply about wilderness-zoned lands, Andres Esparza, my grad student, will point out by 2050, this is a good thing culturally, by 2050 we'll be a majority-minority country. But if the majority of our society are people from cultures who feel alienated by wilderness, who's left to fight for it? And so we got to figure out now, working with people where they live, learning from how they view the value of wildness, and figuring out together how it can be a healing process to fight for wildness, a renewing process, ecologically renewing, socially renewing, spiritually renewing. So I'll close tonight with a final thought on the power of that renewal and the power of what I was saying earlier about John Muir, and how to him 100 years ago he would have called us crazy if we said after the failure of Hetch Hetchy that we'd have all this wilderness acreage. It's still under threat. We're seeing Anwar now, as with the new tax bill, that's now going to be exploited rights. I'm not saying the fight's over at all, but what's our version of that 100-year vision? And I think it's a new story. This new story of humans as partners with the more than human world in Co-Creating Wildness. And Vandana Shiva is an author from India, and she works with farmers who've been displaced by 75 years of development, to the point that 250,000 farmers in India have taken their lives in the last 20 years. And she created a farm where they can come back and reskill and reconnect with the power of land and talk about the opposite of renewal, 250,000 suicides. So she's trying to reconnect people with their original farming practices to help renew how their original ecological relationships were created and renew their own way of being and their own lives. Here's what she has to say. I'll end with her. When I talk about the infinite creative energy of the universe, I am talking about Gaia's self-organizing energy and the creative human energy to work and to produce, to organize, and to transform. In India and around the world, this human energy has helped cultivate the self-organizing energy of the world. In particular, the creativity, innovation, and decision-making power of women, who still produce 80% of the world's food, has significantly driven the world's biodiversity. The majority of the 80,000 plant species that humans have cultivated have emerged from the self-organizing living energies of women. In other words, if we're going to redefine wildness, we have to simultaneously redefine humans as co-creators of wealth with nature. So let's not just be dragged down by the really disheartening, disturbing examples of social, political, and ecological tyranny we're seeing around us. Let's figure out how we can work together with all human cultures and the power, the creative forces of nature to create livelihoods that renew biodiversity and in turn renew our purpose on this planet, which is to co-create wildness. Thank you.
So I would just, before we do some questions, I just want to add that the gentleman in the video is awesome. The people that helped write this book are awesome. I've had an opportunity to have conversations with them over in Gunnison, and Gary Snyder and the rest of them, a bunch of them. And I just highly recommend, if you're interested in this stuff, to go watch the videos, check out the book, dive in and make your brain, give your brain some exercise and enjoy this conversation. It's a neat thing. So I just, again, thank John for coming over, and I feel so lucky to get to bring him to all of you. So that's awesome.
I feel lucky to be here. Thank you.
And so with that, we have time for a few questions. So please, I'll bring you this microphone. As a reminder, it's to be recorded for grassroots, not to amplify your voice. So we'll start with Fred.
Hi, I was wondering if you saw in the column in the Aspen Times the other day, I think it was by Libwine, about cures for what ail you that don't cost anything. And
I'd love to see it. Was one of them?
It was about, he mentioned people in Japan that have a very high suicide rate because of their incredible work ethic. They work 7/12s at very high intensity jobs, and they can't take it, and they off themselves. And in Japan, instead of giving them antidepressives or whatever, they're starting to take them out into the wilderness and giving them some time off out there to commune with nature, and it's been very effective. In this country, the veterans who are coming back with PTSD are being taken out to the wilderness and allowed to cure themselves that way, and that's been very effective. I just wanted to know if you saw that column.
I did. I want to see it. Part of my crossing the Elks might be reading your newspaper. But I wanted two quick things. One is that when you're talking about the 7/12s of Japan, to me, that's a crisis of the loss of human wildness. You know, Wes Jackson's wildness is released when he figures out perennial polyculture. We're a wild, creative, innovative species, right? And so my concern is that the industrial economy is turning that wild, creative species into like bodies that consume bodies, right? And so that's a crisis. We just hired a new colleague into the MEM, the master's program that I run, Salif Muhammad. Google Salif Muhammad TED Talk. He's an eco-psychologist. You were asking about this. He's an eco-psychologist, and he works on how connection with nature and wilderness. He's finding it can replace Ritalin for ADHD. He's working with veterans. So I'm glad you asked that question.
I have 2 questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, Sarah's in charge.
Okay, I have 2 questions, but you know, this Wes Jackson,
Yeah.
all that stuff that you're talking about kind of makes me sad a little bit. I mean, I'm 62, so I'm the back end of the baby boom generation. And are you saying that, when you talk about Wes Jackson and his work, are you saying that we should begin to turn away from the wilderness concept, that this era is over?
I'm glad you asked that. I am not saying that. I'm saying we have to figure out how the power of the wilderness movement can be strengthened rather than threatened by people co-creating wildness in non-wilderness places. And I can give you examples, right, through time of there being tension, right, between wilderness and social justice. When the United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez approached the Central Valley chapter of the Sierra Club saying, help us with DDT, Sierra Club said, that's not our issue. That's a problem, right? And so I'm looking for, to me, environmental justice, Michael Howard in Chicago, working landscapes, Wes Jackson, and wilderness, the 110 million acres that were fought for, those 3 corners of a movement brought together in solidarity would be unstoppable. That's what I'm looking for. Yeah.
Okay, goody. I'm wondering if the generational fear that, what was his name that he was talking,
Michael Howard.
Michael Howard was talking about the fear of going into the forest because of what happened during the slave era. And I hope this is an appropriate question, but I'm wondering if this might be part of the reason why it's difficult to get African Americans involved in the environmental movement. That's been an issue with a lot of the big national environmental organizations. I mean, I've read a lot about it, saying that they're basically white organizations. There are not a lot of people of color. Does that have anything to do with it?
If you go on the Headwaters website, the conference we run, you'll see Michael's talk, and he opens with that. He says he went to community forum, and he was talking about ecosystems and soil health and water quality, and an African-American neighbor raised his hand and said, why are we talking about white people stuff, right? The more interesting chapter in here with reference to your question is by a woman named Mistinguette Smith. She runs an organization called the Black Land Project. And there's a video of her. That's one of the documentaries I did. Her chapter's very powerful. She's more of a social scientist, and she's interviewed across socioeconomic geography African Americans from all walks of life about their connection with land. And she said there's so much diversity, but the common thread is this fear. Showing an image of a tree, a story of a hanging will come up. And so her chapter is really powerful. And so I can't answer why they're not more active in the environmental movement. I think it also has to do with how we talk about issues, right? Like, I'm a bearded white hiker who moved from New Jersey in 1992 to find better snow, right? New Jersey might have better snow this week, actually. But I need to think through what's going to be compelling for other walks of life, Someone who had the word wild imposed on them, I got to be more thoughtful about how I use that word, right? So, yeah.
All right, we'll do one more question.
And then I could do one-on-one chats over here. We got the book for $25, $30 on Amazon, Exploited Labor Conditions. Buy it here. Buy it here. Please, price.
Dr. Hausdoerffer, since you said that you just came back from Rome and the summit with mountain communities from throughout the world, could you just speak a little bit to some takeaways, maybe connected to your concept of wildness?
Yes. Did I plant that question in your brain? My goal was to conclude with this point, but Vandana Shiva is so great, I just wanted to let her finish. Wildness is renewal, right? The source of our renewal is snowpack, right? billions of people across the planet for their water and their food, and their, right? The Indian civilization eating the Ganges, right? The ability, my grandparents were ski bums that retired early to a trailer at the base of Cannon Mountain, and I moved west and brainwashed my daughters to ski 60 days a year, right? The loss of snowpack is not only the basis of the ecosystems and cultures and civilizations of the West and the world, it's also the loss of a way of life in a place, right? Whether it's a snowboarder in Aspen or it's an Inuit being removed from their land because the ice is melting and the storms are now hitting their village instead of the buffer of the ice. Mountains of the world are the basis of our renewal. And so you know how the island communities have been organizing because they're going to be flooded, and they started to become more compelling and pushing the UN to push their nations to come together on climate change to mitigate. Now we're seeing, and Karen Carreño is the real leader. She's the chair of the North American Steering Committee that pushes the UN on mountain issues. She lives in Muir Valley, right? And we saw 75 nations come together to talk about how do we fight for these sources of renewal, the mountain communities of the world. And it was, I will say, it was inspiring, not just to see collective solidarity. It was humbling to learn that we're the ones that are affluent mountain communities, but we're really talking about the world's mountain communities being impoverished. So how do we learn from that? And then inspired by two words that were not uttered by any of the 75 countries over 3 days at the UN: Donald Trump. The world is just walking by us like you walk by the playground bully, and they don't fucking need us. Wasn't that inspiring? And Carreño and Eric, do you have anything to add? Yes? And it's let me just see if they have anything to add from the meeting. Or about your organization, Aspen International Mountain Foundation, how people can get involved.
Very quickly, stand up. Oh dear. The Aspen International Mountain Foundation actually evolved out of the Aspen Sister Cities program, because all of our sister cities in Aspen are in mountains, and we've been trying to promote sustainable mountain development. The UN has an organization called the Mountain Partnership, and I would really recommend all of you to look into it. It is a collective of mountain advocates for water, for biodiversity, for culture, for all the issues that John's been talking about. And we're really, most of you should at some point be involved in this and know more about this organization. But I think you should probably get a lot of information from the website, mountainpartnership.org. And you're welcome to contact me as well.
Awesome. So with that, we're going to make a wrap. Thanks for coming. Have another cookie, and we'll see you next week with Ospreys. Thanks again to John.